Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Marlon Rollins. I'm the president of the Renewal Health Group. I am so excited about this very next presentation. Our highly esteemed presenters here, and I'm going to read your bios too, but this is really, really exciting. And I wish everybody had the opportunity to kind of hear about what you're doing, because this truly is changing the way in which we think about providing healing at a neurological level. So we heard earlier about kind of the gut, and if you saw when there was a slide, the gut talking to the brain on the telephone kind of thing. So you've heard from kind of one end. Now we're going to hear from the top end about how you can really heal. So I just find that really fascinating, because I think if you're a practitioner, you always think about this mind-body connection, and this technology that you're going to hear about today really underscores that. And some of you have experienced it or seen it in practice and seen some phenomenal outcomes. So this is really, like I said, really transforming the way we're providing care. So my honor to really present to you our presenters today, Dr. Jen. And you'll see, just from what I'm going to tell you here today, about the folks that are pioneering this cutting edge technology, really why it's become what it is today. So I'm really excited about them presenting. We have Dr. Jen, who's presenting with us today. He is a medical school graduate who practiced clinical psychology until 1986. In the past 30 years, he's been focused primarily on teaching and research at the University of California, Irvine, and USC's Keck Medical School Center for Neural Restoration, where he leads the work on neuromodulation. His main academic interest can be found out through the neurophysical process in normal and abnormal cognition, using various types of sensory stimulations and neural imaging recording. He has found that the brain cognitive process is discrete, and its accuracy depends on the internal rhythmic oscillation. The rhythmicity itself, however, is tunable via proper external stimulation. This discovery opens up a new avenue for treatment of mental health disorders. During the past 2 decades, he has studied a novel physical treatment, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS. Using an individual's unique intrinsic brainwave frequency, he has successfully treated many patients with various types of neuropsychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia, major depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, brain injury, substance use disorders, and autism. Several results have been published in peer-reviewed journals and presented on academic conferences with this newest advancement on non-invasive neuromodulation electromagnetic brain pulsing treatment. Dr. Jen introduces work that many describe as game-changing, and it is. Yeah. And he's been doing it for many years. Joining him today also, Dr. Judi Kosterman. Clear my throat. Through local and state national programs in prevention, intervention, and treatment of mental health and substance use disorders, Judi's contributions of education, healthcare, workforce development, criminal justice, military veterans are many. As a high school principal, Dr. Judi ran directly into problem kids and drugs. This barrier to learn catalyzed her commitment and determination to find solutions. She served as Washington State Drug Control Executive and subsequently held 3 positions at our nation's capital as the National Policy Advisor and member of the team directing the White House National Youth and Drug Anti-Drug Media Campaign in the Office of the National Drug Control Policy, Director of the HHS SAMHSA National Center for the Advancement of Prevention, NCAP, and the Executive Vice President of Community Anti-Drug Coalition of America. Following a decade of national service, Judi helped build the world's first live online SUD treatment program as Senior Vice President of CRC Health Group, served as Senior Vice President with the West Care Foundation Incorporated, and a Senior Vice President of the Newport Brain Research Lab, where she began her work with the neuroscience of Dr. Jen. Additionally, Judi has contributed as a national board member of All Rise, the National Association for Drug Court Professionals and Justice for Vets, as well as the National Council of Alcoholism and Drug Dependency. Currently, Dr. Judi is co-founder of the Brain Health Leadership Foundation, whose mission is promoting brain health through science, education, and treatment. Please welcome them.
All righty. Okay. Thank you, Marlon. All right, so welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to do a bit of a 2-part, kind of a streaming series here that will begin today. I want to take some time to just introduce you to some of the basics of the science that Dr. Jin will then be really talking about in depth at another session tomorrow, although he's here with us this afternoon as well and will be part of the Q&A, but we'll just kind of take it from one step to the next. So, you know, people read a bio, but the truth is, I'm you. I really am who you are. Because as a young educator and working in high schools with adolescents, you know, I ran into something I would call barriers to learning. And that became really more of a concern to me than what was happening with the learning. Because, you know, students in adolescence are dealing with all kinds of things. And if we can't somehow solve for that, then their ability to really absorb everything else we want to do with them is really put at a disadvantage. And so I began in a public school in the state of Washington and spent 15 years actually in public school education. And along that path, it really became my concern that we could solve for those things that present, particularly when I sat in the chair of a high school vice principal. By the way, not a title you should take lightly. Because when you are a vice principal, you indeed work with vice. That's your job. You work with all the problems that are going on, whether it's truancy to pregnancy to everything in between. Those are the kids lined up at your door all day long, every day, all week long, all year long. And I didn't know anything stepping into that job, really, about substance use and mental health. I hadn't taken classes in that area. I was an educator. But I learned that my very best and first teachers were the students that I talked to every day, who, by the way, wanted to talk to an adult about what was going on, who would not pass judgment in that conversation. And so that's really where it began for me, learning in a sort of OJT scenario about all things mental health and substance use related. You know, later I got more education in those areas and became really a person who went from being the school woman, the school lady, who was always talking about drugs and alcohol and mental health. And the kinds of things we did in our program, I'm not quite sure how this is going to work for me because nothing's happening. Maybe I point it here? Here, there we go. It took me from working out the kinds of programs in a school building that now we're doing intervention, sending kids to treatment programs, having a scenario in the building where when kids came back, we developed a first-hour program that supported their recovery, for which they got credit, and trying to actually even create a half-day IOP in a school. Because these kids, by the way, don't have a full schedule. You know, they've either been dropped, kicked, or punted out of a classroom, and so you're trying to keep them in school. I really could not successfully get that done because people would tell me I was an educator, not a healthcare provider. This was healthcare, and I'm trying to deal with education. Until I left schools and came to work at a state level in a state capital as the governor's advisor on substance use policy. That was a different position. Now I'm working with substance use across the whole continuum of care, but also not just in education, but in everything related to prevention, intervention, interdiction, treatment, supply, demand reduction, recovery, the whole continuum, which from my frame of reference is not really a straight line, it's a circle. Because where you have experience and you have recovery, you feed prevention and education, and it just kind of works like that. So in that position, then I could create an IOP in a school. And we did in the state of Washington. We did lots of other really fun and interesting things, and we had legislation that was passed that put actually dollars in the coffer, dedicated revenue stream, alcohol, tobacco taxes, and soda pop, penny a can, that we taxed, and everything in that dedicated revenue went into the issues of substance use in that state, which included the building of community-based coalition in every single county of community members who would build a plan around what they needed to do in their county, and then we funded that plan. The requirement in the law was that at a table, all 6 sectors of a community represented: healthcare and business and clergy and education, et cetera. And we didn't evaluate your plan, by the way. It was your plan. It was your community. If you didn't have those 6 sectors represented, no go. But as long as they were at the table and you figured it out together, we funded that. That kind of thing really worked at a grassroots level, along with all the things that we're doing with professionals in this field, ranging from what was happening in prevention to treatment, and involving law enforcement as well along the way. We always talked about that as simply an intervention with a badge, That's how that can work. And then from there, I ended up going from Washington State to Washington, D.C., and taking that whole concept of building community-based efforts nationwide. So Robert Wood Johnson, the charity arm, of Johnson & Johnson, funded a national nonprofit that began to build coalitions across the country. 5,000 of them to date. And that was an exciting time. My role with all of that and working with people at a grassroots level still nationwide led to an opportunity to work with what was going on in government in DC, just like in any state capital. When you're working on an issue, whether it's in Olympia, Washington, or right now I live in Nevada, Carson City, Nevada. Finally, by the way, there is a freeway to Carson City. It was the only state capital in America without one for quite a time. But no matter where you're working on these issues and working with policy, you need to know everybody else who is. And so we were involved with everything from National Guard at the Pentagon, because they were involved at state levels where these people were working with all things border and customs and supply related, as well as in Washington, D.C., then that became the Pentagon and the White House. And as things unfolded, events happened that took me to host a big event for the White House with a coalition in Atlanta. Getting a call saying we were going to have this big launch of a nationwide media campaign that's going to be focused on youth, middle school, and adults who influence their lives. And the president's going to be there. He's going to kick it off. Do you have a coalition, Judi, in Atlanta, and can you fill the dome? I'm like, sure. So we proceeded to do that. And it was an interesting experience, that's for sure. But this was in about late 90s, actually, going into it. So as that occurred, I learned that when a president comes to something, they do a security sweep, which means there's an hour, maybe it's 90 minutes, between the sweep and the event. And this Superdome was filled, a lot of it, with middle school kids, because they were the target of the campaign. So then I found myself being responsible for what are we going to do for 90 minutes? And building the world's biggest pep assembly. That's how I saw it. So all of it went well, which then took me from that experience with the coalition into this place called the White House, where I ended up actually leading that campaign and working nationwide from that position. After that service and the tenure during that administration, while I was there in D.C., I left there. I ended up with experience in this building, the Pentagon, where, because the gentleman that I worked for and really directly with in the White House at the time was a 4-star general, our office had all kinds of military, and I found myself involved in something at the Pentagon they call counter-drug strategy, and just training and teaching around those issues. And, by the way, National Guard at that time sent men and women into middle schools across America on the heels of this campaign we had done from the White House, teaching prevention to kids, in classrooms. All of that was good. And I share all of that with you just to say that I've had a big view. I've been really blessed to have a big view of things across the continuum. But as I had that opportunity and learned as much as I possibly could, in working with all of the people who work in our field, I was always looking for what could make things better. Because the outcomes really, to use a very technical scientific word, suck. They just aren't what you want them to be. And people like you and I, we really care about these outcomes. We're working with individuals, whether they're kids in a school, whether you're dealing with people who are now involved with law enforcement, ultimately end up incarcerated. You're dealing with people that you're doing intervention and sending to treatment programs. They're in recovery, just working programs. All of that's going on. But if you look at the data, to this day now in 2024, the data really don't change in terms of outcomes and what we would classify successful. So I had the surprise, and now what I really consider the honor, when I was working at the Pentagon. The difficulty during those years, was that 9/11 happened. So all that we were doing domestically, focused with the National Guard's involvement, was turned upside down. They were federalized, they were deployed, and off they went to Iraq. And so the men and women with whom I was working were going and then coming back, and all of the dynamics changed. And I'll never forget the first time I really encountered that, because we'd be a group sitting in a room like this, and I would say to people, how many of you have been gone since I saw you last? They'd raise their hands. I knew they'd been deployed. And this one gentleman said to me, I really need to talk to you at the break, if that's okay, today. And I said, sure. So I met with him kind of in the corner of the room, and he said to me that in his deployment, his job was to route out insurgents and lead his platoon in doing that. So they would knock down doors, go into an Iraqi house, and he shared with me that on one occasion he did exactly that, and there was an Iraqi guy on the other side of the door who was speaking a language he didn't understand, and then who went to put his hands under a table. He said, my training was take him out, but I didn't do that. I tackled him instead of shoot him. And he said the good news is he was reaching for his Iraqi police badge. The bad news is I broke my ankle in my tackling maneuver. So I went back to base. They had me wrap my ankle so I could put in the boot tomorrow and do that mission all over again. And they handed me a quart jar of white pills. And he goes, now I'm home. I'm out of white pills, Judi. And I don't know what to do. And I'm a counter-drug guy. I should have known better. And I said, it doesn't quite work that way, does it? It was during that time that a colonel that I met through a sequence of events introduced me to the guy right here, sitting here, Dr. Jin. Now, Dr. Jin is an interesting guy, and those of you who already know him know that he's an interesting guy. And he's telling me about all of this work that he is doing, actually with autistic children. Now, I'm doing other kind of work. I am dealing with substance use and post-traumatic stress, depression, traumatic brain injury, anxiety, autism wasn't really on my list, and chronic, everything else here were the issues that I was dealing with. He's talking about autistic kids and how he can take an autistic child to neurotypical in this medical scientific work that he's doing. I didn't understand a word of it. But I knew about this. And as I began to think about all these treatment outcomes, whether in long-term terms or overall, and the difficulty we were having with them, I was still on my own quest to learn something new, something different, something else, so that we could do things differently. And I had already begun to ask myself the questions, like, are we missing something? What is it that we're not doing? And have we talked about common sense? Have we missed sort of the forest for the trees in this whole picture? And asking myself about science, because he had mentioned that to me. He was working with neuroscience. I hadn't really been talking to people about neuroscience. I was living in a behavioral health framework. And And so the questions became, are we really needing to ask ourselves about evidence-based science or science-based evidence? One of the experiences I'd had in Washington, too, was to lead something called the National Center for the Advancement of Prevention. So this is prevention education, taking research to practice in the same way we do so in the treatment side. And in that role, when I moved into that position, there was all kinds of amazing stuff in the room, right, in this building and in this project. But none of it had really gotten out the door. None of it. And so I decided at one point, I'm going to take it out. There was a big prevention conference, National NPN conference, happening, and I thought I'm going to take it with me. But I stamped we created products out of the research. We stamped it all draft. We're taking it to the conference so that people can give us input from the field. This was my excuse, because it wasn't yet ready really for publication. I took it to the conference, happened to be in Reno, Nevada, where I now live, but not then, and people scooped it up. But we had all these conversations at that time about evidence-based, evidence-based, evidence-based. And one of the jobs that I was overseeing was the whole list of promising practices and evidence-based practice. And by the federal government was giving you that kind of status, whether it was your treatment program or your prevention program. And so it was all about amassing evidence. But when I began talking to this guy about science, he's asking the question, what is the science that the evidence is based on, right? I mean, right now we're all going to be observing a trial going on in this country. On both sides of that trial, lawyers will be building evidence to both sides of that case all day long, every day. So evidence really might not be as valuable in our just experiential work with it as is the science that it's built on. What is that really? Maybe we need to really start there. And so for me, as I began to look at all of these things, I'm just asking myself the question, really about the brain itself. What did I know about the brain? Really, not much, not in physiological terms. I asked myself, is there a way we could actually see inside of it? No. Stethoscopes and other probes are not going to help us with that either. Or is there a way that we can measure the physiological functions of the brain? Not that I knew about. But today we are in a place where all of that is possible. So I know that many of you are involved with some science around all of this big neuroscience introduction into our world of behavioral health. How many of you are, in fact, working somewhere where neuroscience is what you're involved with? TMS, some of you for sure? Right. So for me, it was all a learning curve. I had to get there. But what I know now is that we can see into the brain through a process called an EEG. We can actually look at brain waves and learn about the frequency and through which they work and the categories of frequency across the frequency spectrum. And we can look at that through this medical device called an EEG. Now, my experience with EEG was hospital television shows, where they've got the monitor and you have these squiggly lines, looks more like an earthquake measurement tool seismograph. And that's about it. That's about all I knew. Today, what we know is, or what I know, many people have known it way before me. In fact, today I found myself working with physics, in this work. And I took Physics 101 in college, pass-fail, because I was afraid to screw up my GPA, in physics. But now I know a little bit more about it. So I know that there are frequencies, spectrums, and waves. When brain waves are working, sometimes they're working very slowly in a delta wave, which we need them to do when we're wanting to sleep. Sometimes they're working in a theta wave, which is also slow. We experience that when we're drowsy and yawning and transitioning from being asleep perhaps or awake, or we can feel that way when we're using drugs of different kinds, starting with alcohol and all the rest of them. There are alpha waves that are the kinds of waves that really are essential to our daily executive function, decision making, and all of that. And there are beta waves that are really fast waves that we all need if we're at the starting line of a 100-yard dash, or we're trying to hike a football in a football game, or we're being attacked by somebody and we're in danger. We need all of these waves. They all have a frequency that function for us. We need all of that different range of frequency depending on how it is we live our lives and allowing us to do so. But we cannot live in any one of those 24/7. There has to be a change, that experience. And the EEG today no longer is simply a way of learning whether someone's dead or alive or has had a seizure, but now in a very sophisticated way of evaluating an EEG, we can learn the whole journey and, in essence, the life story of your actual brain, the organ itself, and how it functions, and what's happened to it along its journey. So as we can now do that, we can take the raw data from an EEG. It's a lovely experience. It's not a good hair day, but it's valuable to us. So we can gather that data through an EEG. We can record an EEG that's going to tell us what's going on between your ears. And then we can take that EEG, turn it into a report that then can be shared with you, the patient, by a doctor who can read such a report. It's my friend and soon to be yours, Dr. Jin, who has really created a way for us to do that and taken those squiggly lines to the kind of functionality and ability for us to share them in ways that you and I can understand what's going on in that report, and we can share it with a patient. So that's an exciting thing. So the other question then becomes, the fact that we can do that is an amazing thing. And the question then becomes, now that we can do that, how is it that we might be able to change what we see? Is there a way? Is there a possibility? And that's really where TMS comes in. TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, uses magnetic resonance. And initially, part of the fact that TMS came into the medical marketplace, we'll call it, is that heretofore this thing called ECT was happening when people were in desperate need of something beyond medication that might in fact help a patient, particularly with treatment-resistant depression. So enter TMS, which is no longer driven by electricity, which can't penetrate a skull, by the way. That's why ECT is the kind of experience where it's jacked up to such a level, and then we kind of hope for the best, in terms of that treatment. But magnetic resonance, just like in MRI imaging, we now have TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, not magnetic resonance imaging, but a way to use that same magnetic resonance to stimulate neurons, because that magnetic resonance can penetrate the skull and can be taken to the capacity for changing how neurons actually function. And that's the value of this device called TMS. There's a history behind TMS. And again, I want to mention Dr. Jin because this is his history. Starting in 1987, beginning to think about brainwave and transcranial magnetic stimulation before we ever saw it, with an FDA clearance for safety. And then going through to 2009, which was after the 2008 introduction of the device itself, creating a way of using it in treating the brain. And then another therapy step in the development of TMS in 2014, which brought about using the synchronizing through TMS to be based on the individual patient's EEG. And then in 2020, being able to not only take that process from EEG process, what we know is going on between someone's ears, to the treatment of it, but to creating a technique that is now not even any longer repetitive, which is how TMS has been delivered. It's that tapping, rhythmic noise. Those of you who are working with it and listening to it all day, perhaps. But that's not exactly how brainwaves work. They don't beat like a drum, nor does a heart. We have heart rate variability, and we have brain wave variability as well. So today, we can use an EEG to help us learn what that looks like in an individual patient's frequency fingerprint, and then use a TMS device to deliver the stimulation based on the inter-period variability, we call it, of brainwaves, this irregularity that they have. And so when you hear TMS delivered in this way, which we describe as stochastic, how many of you are involved with music, by the way, in some way? So you've heard the word staccato in your music training. So stochastic is a variation, really of that verb, that root. So it's rhythmic, but has variability, doesn't beat like a drum to a metronome. And that's a way in which we can now deliver this actual treatment as well, is using it in that way. So that is the history of TMS that brings us now to a protocol that involves these steps. So the first one is that initial EEG. And following the EEG, the data from the EEG today, rather than one guy in a back room reading an EEG treating autistic children based on how he can do so, we now can feed the data from an EEG into a cloud system that does the analysis that he would do, and then create a report that we can read and share with a patient that is understandable for the physician who's doing that report with the patient as well as to the patient. And then we, at the same time, produce a protocol in that whole technology loop that is for that individual patient, unique from all other treatment that would be done to anybody else. Everybody's brain is different, it's unique, and every protocol is unique as well in this process. I want to, so we do the evaluation, develop the protocol, deliver the treatment based on that protocol, and then have a way of doing an EEGs subsequently throughout the treatment process that give us the objective data and evidence to the brain change. So it's not just based on what a patient tells us about how it is that they feel today. I want to share with you that every step of this process is profound for the patient. And one of the most profound moments in my experience in working with patients is when this report is reviewed by a doctor with a patient. And they see on the screen now an illustration of their own brain function, their own EEG. And it's if they would be seeing the X-ray of a broken ankle, to kind of put it into a similarity. And for the first time, when we're working with people who are struggling with mental health scenarios, substance use, they can disassociate themselves from what is on that screen. It's not about them being a loser and their character being in question and their weakness in their sobriety journey and being blamed for all of that, which is who they now think they are. We say to them, no, this, what you're seeing on this screen, it's not who you are. It's what's happened in your life's journey to your brain. There's a physiological difference here. It's not about you. It's about what's happened to you along the way. And I see those patients take a huge sigh of relief for the first time. And then the next question comes, can you fix it? Can you fix it? And today, we have the capacity to do that. How is this different from TMS? In all of these ways, and we've already talked about most of that. TMS in this column, and the first indication coming from the FDA was right dorsal left dorsal prefrontal cortex. Depression lives there, was the thought, and we're going to zap you out of it. And we're going to do that at 120% of threshold. We're going to do that at 10 hertz. Why 10 hertz? Do you know why we chose 10 hertz? Anybody? No. So those waves we were looking at earlier, delta waves, they have a hertz range from 0 to 3. Theta waves, they have a range from 3 to 8. Alpha waves have a range from 8 to 13. What's the middle of that range? 10, right? So it was sort of like, all right, we're going to pick that number. It's the middle of alpha. We're going to give everybody a size 10 shoe. Problem is, we don't all wear a size 10. So with that protocol, we were really, in essence, using this stimulation, this repetitive stimulation, to bully neurons into 10 hertz. But somewhere in that range between 8 and 13 is where your optimal alpha wave lives and functions most optimally. Everybody in this room is going to have a different number. Some people, 9.7. Somebody else, 11.2. Somebody else, 12. I mean, it's going to be somewhere in that range, but not everyone at 10. So that's the big difference here when we use an EEG to learn two things: what's happening in your brain today and where should it be? Where should neurons be functioning for your particular, we'll call it frequency fingerprint? And then not using it at 120% of threshold, which is not exactly a comfortable experience, but from 30 to 80% of motor threshold. Remember that this was first used with autistic children. They're 3 years old, 4, 5, in fact, earlier better in the treatment of autism. And so as we're treating them, 120% of threshold, not going to be a good thing to start with, right? And we're not wanting to bully everybody anywhere. We really want to gently nudge neurons into their optimal function throughout the whole of your brain, front to back, side to side, not just here, to deal with one labeled indication. So it gives us the ability to work with the whole of the brain. And to do that in a stochastic way, in mirroring how it is that your own brain waves actually work. So this advancement since 1987 to 2020 and now through 2024 is a big change in the way in which TMS began and the way in which most people are actually still using it today, by being driven by this individualization. So I wanted to just do one thing real quickly here to give you a sense of the difference, particularly those of you who are involved with it. Let's see if we can get it to work here. Yeah, here we go. So the EEG recording, starts out looking like this. We're going to really function on that focus on that alpha wave, ultimately our executive functioning, and we're going to look at the variable pulse of the wave for you. Not like a drum. There's variation in it. And so the neurotechs we're working with, who are doing this all day long, they are able to actually hear the difference for every single patient's delivery of the protocol. That's how it's an exciting time. So the early clinical findings in all of this look like this. Schizophrenia is one of the conditions that this has been taken to, and the clinical trials have had success at a rate of 55%. Post-traumatic stress disorder, an amazing effectiveness, and I will share with you a little bit about a specific trial in that area. Autism spectrum disorder, being to take children in CAR scores from autistic to neurotypical. In substance use and comorbid depression and anxiety, of course, which most of us, as we're dealing with conversations here, are involved with every day. And also post-COVID. COVID yeah, it changes how the brain works. And long haul COVID is one of those. In fact, I'll just share with you my own personal experience with this. I've known Dr. Jin now for almost 14 years. Yeah, and it's not all been good. No, it hasn't. But if you want to hear some stories, I've got a few. So when I first had an EEG, I was not a candidate for the treatment. My brain seemed to be functioning okay until I had COVID, which has now been 3 years ago. And I was down. I was down for 2 weeks, and I was miserable with it. And I knew, sort of coming out what I thought was the other end of it, that I was going to be fine. But I knew I wasn't. I knew that my brain function wasn't what I wanted it to be. If I were speaking to you at that time, I would be searching for words, in my conversation, and I just wasn't sharp. And I was working in and out of a clinic in the Reno area that's doing this protocol I've described, and the neurotechs there, they knew that I wasn't really sharp, wasn't myself, so to speak. So I ended up, and they didn't tell me that, of course, but I've kind of figured it out myself. So I called Dr. Jin, and he said to me, I know, the boys already called me, from the clinic. And then he said to me, Judi, you're finished with COVID, but it's not through with you. So let's do an EEG. And sure enough, that EEG did not look like my normal EEG. So I underwent 10 days, 10 sessions of treatment in 10 days. And I knew by the third day, fourth day, that I was on my way back. And this is a protocol that is really important right now. We have not treated lots of people. We're involved with some clinical trials now with COVID, with big hospital systems in the country that shall remain nameless. They're not through with those trials, but we've seen its effectiveness, not only with my condition, I would call it brain fog, fatigue, but with restoration of taste, sense of taste and smell, as well as tinnitus can be a part of long haul COVID as well. So these are some exciting things. And this is just a quick picture of raw data becoming digitized in a way that we can really see what those brain waves look like across that continuum of frequency. Also a thermographic way of looking at the brain. The top one is the first one for a patient. This was the second one in 5 treatments. I won't get into the detail of that. For that, you have to come to Dr. Jin's session tomorrow. So, make sure you get here for that. But I want to share with you just this one other trial. You might remember that, when I met him, I was working with veterans and returning warriors. So the first clinical trial with which I had any awareness or involvement was focused on post-traumatic stress. Now, these men and women came, certainly, they all had been diagnosed by the VA with post-traumatic stress. Everyone in the trial had already had that diagnosis. They had undergone every treatment available in the VA, to include stellate ganglion injections, all kinds of things. Prolonged exposure kinds of therapy. It's supposed to desensitize you to the Humvee explosion, so you get to do that 90 times in 90 days, relive it. Just a lot of things. But when they came to us in this trial, they, on the measurements used by the VA, had not moved a point in all the treatment they had had. And so for those men and women, mostly men, I was a randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trial. So they're divided into 2 groups. There's the treatment group and the control group, but they don't know what group they're in. They all think they're being treated. So they're going through their treatment process. But they, only half of them were. So as the trial went underway, at 2 weeks, these were the results of the trial. Starting at the top corner, their CARS scores, or the CARS is autism. Their PCLM scores, post-traumatic checklist, military, used by the VA to measure their post-traumatic stress, were highly symptomatic for both groups. The blue line is the control group. The red line is the treated group. At the end of 2 weeks, this was the difference. Now, I want to mention that the other thing that happened, as with these men and women, is that they were oriented in their orientation together about the value of circadian rhythm to their brain health. And so they were taught that, how to, for free, change how your brain works by trying to get your circadian rhythm right side up. It has to do with morning light, being outside and getting morning light, which will trigger the building of your melatonin all day, dump later, you go to sleep. So they had some of that, they all had some of that knowledge, but at 2 weeks, this difference really led to opening the label of the trial, treating all of them for another 2 weeks, and the outcome was here at the end of this trial. So this is only a 4-week trial. Stunning results, going from highly symptomatic to no longer symptomatic, and getting the attention of the military at that time, Department of Defense. So in addition to the PTS, which was the focus of the trial, and as you do a clinical trial, you focus on one variable, not 7, not 10. You really want to have data that's clear and singular. Nevertheless, as we're interacting with these men and women going through the trial, all kinds of other things were happening as well, including not just the reduction in their score, but their quality of sleep. 96% had increased quality of sleep, which happened, by the way, for most of them in the first 5 days of their treatment. It's one of the first responses to this. Their pain scores, and they all had chronic pain, were reduced. They were voluntarily weaning themselves off of their opioids. I remember speaking to one Marine who said to me, I'm off all Norco but one at the end of the first week. No one was talking to them about titrating themselves off their drugs at all, but they were feeling so good with this treatment that they were doing it themselves. And decreasing their opioid use, decreasing their alcohol use, and these data points held, beyond the trial. This was an exciting thing for me, because remember, I came from substance use in particular, not from the mental health side first, but from the substance use side first. And we found that this protocol was directly changing what was going on there. Yes?
Is the results sustained over time?
Yeah, well, as long as we have followed these men and women. Now, one of the things that we believe changes brain waves is really encapsulated in the word trauma. Whether it's concussive injury, that for sure we would call trauma, but also psychogenic trauma. So in the case, for example, with military, they came with all of it, all of it. But for some of us, we're not in theaters of war, experiencing that. But psychogenic trauma is it causes just as the kind of change to brain waves that concussive trauma can do as well. So you have, a nasty, long, protracted divorce. You lose your closest friend, a loved one dies. These are traumas. And so if trauma reoccurs in your journey, there's definitely the possibility that brainwaves are going to change in that process. But in the good news with our veterans was that they were redeployed, many of them. But now they're being redeployed with a brain that actually is working for them, is on their side, if you will, and which was their term actually. And now they'll come back, but do we need to do 4 weeks of treatment? No, maybe 4 days of treatment? Or or someone slips and falls on the ice, hits their head, that's a trauma. They come back in for treatment, yeah, that's maybe 2 or 3 days of treatment, not 4 weeks of treatment. So those are the kinds of experiences that can then change our brainwaves. Again, life goes on, and we have journeys as we're going through our lives. One of the things that we say, by the way, to patients who are undergoing this kind of protocol is we're reminding them all of the time that although this protocol can change your brain reliably and predictably based on the science every day, all day long in a clinic where this is happening, you have to change your life. So behavioral health is equally important. Equally important. I really want to stress that. If we were thinking about the brain being treated like other aspects of our physical body, we would not use the term rehab to describe a surgery, right? Now you have a surgery. I actually just had one on a knee almost a year ago. And that surgery was not called rehab. They actually changed what was going on with my knee through an acute phase of the difficulty I was having and fixed it, or physiologically. Then they sent me to rehab, which was essential, by the way, to the fact that I'm standing here, right, and walking. The same is also, I think, an equivalent kind of way for us to think differently about what we do in our work in behavioral health, with mental health, substance use, addiction, all of that. And we've done a disservice to ourselves, I think, by calling treatment programs rehab. It's like, okay. That in medical terms is the second step, not the first. And now as we're working in the field that is dealing, is particularly we're working today with insurance and payment, and the equivalency and parity between what we're doing in behavioral health with medical health. Really need to think a lot about the words we use to describe what we do, so that we're thinking about it in equivalent ways. And as we're doing the kind of treatment we can now do with the physiology of the brain, I think of that as the intervention, the surgical intervention, if you will. It's not surgical, it's not invasive, it's not pharma, but it's definitely an intervention at that point in a physiological way. After which, we need rehab. We need behavioral health because people need to change their life. Even a cardiologist who's going to put you under to do what he or she does to fix your heart, when you awaken, he's going to say, you need to go down the hall and talk to so-and-so about exercise, diet, alcohol, tobacco use. Because he doesn't want what he's just done, or she, to be changed by your behavior, right? So this is a place where we all come together on the medical and behavioral side to really work with people about the journey of their life and the impact it's had on their brain and ultimately what we call their brain health. So with that, I just remember this all the time in the work that the people I talk to, because inevitably I'll talk to somebody about this protocol and they'll be focused on a given indication that they have. Maybe they've been labeled, with some mental health diagnosis or something, or someone they care about has been. And then they'll ask me about another indication, and then another one, and my answer is yes, 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 and yes. So then the question is, how can one thing treat everything? We don't treat everything with this protocol. It's a physiological protocol that treats the brain. It doesn't treat by label, an indication. That's not really how it works. And so I think it's really an important, just for me to always remember that as I'm talking with individuals and interacting around this protocol. And I've had people say to me all the time that, they call me, I work with a guy who's an economic development authority. He leads that in a region of a state. And he's learned about this. He's really excited about it. But every time I see him, he's asking me about another indication. And he goes, well, it works for that too, Judi? I go, yeah, we've been successful with that. And then he said to me, you know what? You are a pain in my ass. Every time I ask you a question, I found out there's something I don't yet know about this. And we just have to flash back and say, it's not about the label. It's really not about the indication. We're talking simply about a medical protocol that treats the actual brain itself. That's what this is all about.
That's how the medical system is set up.
Totally. Even more so, it's how insurance is set up, right? That's right. If you don't have the diagnosis, you don't have the marker, then you don't get the treatment, and nobody pays for it. So, yeah, we've done this to ourselves in that industry. There's no question about it. So with all of that, let's open it for some Q&A. And not only with me today is Dr. Jin, but also sitting next to him, Robin Rednikoff, who's also one of the founders of the Brain Health Leadership Foundation. Robin has a long and rich clinical history that began at a place called Sierra Tucson in substance use specifically. Subsequently built something called National Outreach, which was the first, how many of you know Monica, by the way, in this room? A lot of you? Yeah. So Monica is a national navigator. Robin was a national navigator, the first one really in the country, who was trying to place people across the country and set that up before there were, cell phones. It's a lot harder for Robin than it is for Monica. No, and Robin then also owned and ran her own 24/7 residential facility here in LA. So they're both with us. So let's just open this for a little question and answer. I don't even know how much time we have or don't have. Maybe somebody can tell us that. Oh, great. We have some good time. So, so what do you think about any and all of this? Go ahead, Ashley.
About the success rates that you posted. And I noticed, again, I'm a pediatrician, so I'm going to focus on the little people.
Good.
And I noticed that the success rates were anywhere from 47 to 55%.
With autism in particular, yes.
Everything else was so much higher, so I wanted to know
Well, I'm going to let Dr. Jin actually answer that question.
why we had such a low success rate.
Low success, I think it's very high already.
Well, everything else was like, 80%.
Yeah, autism, by the way, so I need to differentiate myself from Judi, the educator. Me as a geek, I don't know I can speak that well, right?
Yeah.
And
Yes,
the
you
time
can.
when I met with Judi, my hair was black. She didn't change it. Yeah, it was so bad.
You too could have this color, Dr. Jin.
Autism is such a big facade out there, okay? Just like every DSM diagnostic criteria, to me, that's a garbage can, okay? So let's say, can you label yourself as a sleepy person? Because there's so many people, feel reason to feel sleep or anything. So that, I have such a question. Myself as a psychiatrist to start with, right? But now I quit my psychiatry practice. I turned out to be a psychiatric academic researcher in neuroscience. Now I quit everything to be a physicist. Okay, so to answer your question is like this. Autism, I don't know how many of you understand the history of psychiatry. Psychiatry in the history, basically crazy people, they were treated as a reverse evolution, meaning that they were not human anymore. They go backwards in evolution, become half human, half animal. So back to the Middle Age time, so they were caged or leashed by ankles and then put them into a cage, only like 3 feet tall. They cannot sit, they cannot stand, they have to halfway in an alpine position. And many people die there. And a lot of time, these crazy people were exhibited as an animal like a zoo. People would just get in to show them, right? And so later, academic people kick in, like 19th century, late 19th centuries. And many people start to label them, call them a schizophrenia or hypophrenic or whatever that term. And one of the most important figures is called Eugene Breuer from Sweden. And he was the one that set the foundation for modern psychiatry. So the first group of people of schizophrenia, they label them as autism. Okay, what is autism? Autism is a way to withdraw from communication, from society, from everything. That's all autism. So that when we see the autistic kids, basically you see them don't want to talk to you. They don't want to look at your eyes. And they just repetitively doing the same old thing back and forth. That's all they do, right? So that to me, this is a highly heterogeneous group. Some of them has Robin has a relative, has young grandson with a Down syndrome. It behaved exactly as the autism. And another autistic kid just recently developed a encephalitis, and as a residual chronic feature is autistic. Okay, and then somebody got a bullet at home, at school, and then become autistic. So there are so many ways to describe autism, so that so far in the past of our research, we haven't differentiated the cause of autism. We just take whoever fit the criteria of autism with a CAR score higher than a certain level. So at the time when we did a study, we included moderate to severe autistic kids. Most of them are not potty trained, not verbal, and no school experience at all. A lot of people can't even talk. So we treat them, set up the criteria. Anybody reduce the CAR score greater than 30%, and you call them neurotypical, which is our psychiatric pediatrician told us. And that's how we come up with the data. But we cannot know whether the responder is a right group we deal with or the other things. For example, you have genetic issues with certain level that you cannot change their brainwave. The reason that when Judi shows that certain brainwave is very synchronized, the other one is not synchronized. I did a study back in UC Irvine about 20 years ago. I look at the people, why somebody is so synchronized, the other one doesn't synchronize. And so we look at all the, back then the genetic sequences wasn't there yet. So we look at the SNP. The SNP basically is a specific candidate gene for certain chemicals. So we look at 7 different neurotransmitters. And initially I thought of dopamine, serotonin may have some role into our EEG. And in reality, we found there was only one chemical and a neurotransmitter related to that, which is BDNF. So today I heard the previous talk and they talk a whole lot about BDNF. Back then, BDNF is just garbage. Nobody knows what it is. So if you have a heterogeneous of a BDNF, meaning that your father and mother contribute different kind of gene to that compound, you tend to have a more chaotic brainwave. If your mother and father gave you the same gene, which is called a homogeneous, and your brain tend to be synchronized. Okay, so I believe my mother and father gave me very different one, and Judi, her grandparents give her the same one. So that's how we're different. So I believe that certain things are genetically already predetermined feature. We cannot change it. But this is just a necessary condition, but not sufficient. So that's how I was thinking about how to get this basic logic into our medical practice. Just like a previous presentation, I know that guy very well, but I think he portrayed the brain as all chemical. But the logic, when you think about the serotonin model, okay, you have a tyrosine and you miss the tyrosine, therefore it becomes depressant, therefore serotonin is the cause of it. If you go back to your basic logic training, it's so weird. Okay, so let me give you a quick story about this, okay? You heard about the superconducting, right? Superconductor, that guy got a Nobel laureate prize and everything. So one day, he was asking to give a lecture, very short lecture. He talked about it. He said, there are 3 types of science out there. One kind is called real science, just like a superconducting. That's himself, right? The other one is a fake science, which is the fabricated data and everything. How many people are still aware of this publication from Harvard? They study all the antidepressants. They pull out the data from FDA, pull them all together as a meta-analysis. It shows no effect whatsoever compared to placebo, compared to old drugs, new drugs. They are exactly the same, no difference at all. This is the biggest study, most important finding published in big journal. UK government already told every physician that we don't endorse antidepressants. US government cannot say that because the lobbyists are standing on every door to stop them. Okay, so this is one type of science. What he called is a pathological science. That's a medical science. Okay, he gave one analogy. He said medical people, how they do called evidence. They recruit 10 people, 20 people, give 10 people tomato soups. Let them drink, every day. Give another group of people with onion soup, drink every day. 2 years later, they follow them up. They found 2 patients in the tomato soup with cancer. You know what the conclusion? They said, oh, tomato soup can cause cancer. Or the conclusion is that onion soup can prevent cancer. That's what the medical science is, okay? Well, the problem right here is that recently, and I turned myself from a, psychodynamic, I learned from Freud's system, and then learned from the real psychiatry in UCLA, and then did all the physiological study. I think that they're all wrong. None of them is right, okay? So the whole thing is that they miss a fundamental law. Basically, it's called first principle. Medicine is not based on science. It's a piece of art. You know how many people are killed by doctors? By pure accident. It's an iatrogenic fatality in this country. 440,000 patients a year. Okay.
It's going to wipe out the globe.
So that's the problem that I think we need to. This is the time to rethink about medicine. And these days we're coaching a whole lot of young people want to get into medicine. How many of you want to get into medical school? Young people, okay? Yeah. So let me tell you, if any young people get into medicine today, still want to follow our model, like a physician, like this kind of things, in 5 years, you're going to be obsolete. You have no future anymore, okay? So that what I believe that the medical school teaching should include 2 things. The basic scientific, the physical science, okay, which is what's the first principles. Okay, the second things you need to learn is linear algebra, which allow you to look at the matrix on the high dimension of the data. If you don't know the data, if you don't know the physics, and you just miss everything. And then pretty soon the machine will replace you. Okay, so my son, only 25-year-old, graduated from Berkeley. He got my 25 years job done in 2 hours. Now he can use his computer to tell every story I want to tell, just instantaneously. So all the reports that Judi was talking about, it was done by him. And took him only a day and a half, finished the programming and everything. Now, I used to live on EEG reading, right? I can read about 10 EEG a day, making $200 each.
Pretty good.
So I've been pretty good, right? My son looked at me and said, oh, you're sick. Now his program on our server, he can do 170,000 EEG per day per server.
We have 4 servers around the world.
Okay, so eventually we can take care of the entire world population just by adding more server on it. Okay, so this is the future. It's on its way already.
It's here.
Okay, so that's the things, I hope you guys can ask some questions, Judi, and I will like to answer it.
Yeah.
Any concerns, anything? Go ahead.
I have a question. I'm under the impression it's been explained to me that the EMBP, the EEG-driven TMS, avoids the contraindications of traditional TMS like medications and seizure disorders. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Oh, yes,
yeah,
very
yeah,
much.
yeah.
Okay, so
For
if you
sure.
review, any neurologists here? No? Okay. Yeah, I don't study that. It's not worth it. Okay, so the seizure is like this. If you look at the EEG, right, seizure is basically all of a sudden the brain becomes super rhythmic. And just like a Tacoma bridge, when the wind blows and all of a sudden collapse. This is called resonant, okay? Applying the resonant in the wrong way, you cause that big things, okay? If you read the literature, what are the things to tend to trigger the seizure? For example, when seizure-prone patients sit in the train, when the train goes through a bunch of light poles, and you have a flickering. The flickering around 3 hertz, then all of a sudden you have a seizure because it's so repetitive. And what is a TMS? TMS just directly shoots the repetitive pulse into your brain. That it will tend to force that resonant response and then trigger seizure. So that's what the contraindication is. And the second thing is that they use this 120% of a motor threshold. So motor threshold is like this. You put a coil in your motor cortex, you zap it with a single pulse, and you gradually crank it up until your arm jump. Okay, that's the threshold that I know I triggered the action potential of your neurons. What I did now, instead of giving you repetitive stimulation, I give you a very random pulse. That's called a stochastic, right? So the random pulse is based on your own intrinsic EEG pattern. So when you look at an EEG in the frequency domain, it's like a bell-shaped curve. So what I did is that, I didn't do that, I asked my son to do that. So we record 10 minutes of data or 19 channels so that we measure every wave of their period over 10 minutes over 19 channels. So that's like a couple of 100 millions of data points, right? So by the end, the computer will tell me what is the mean, what is the standard deviation of your individual pattern. So Judy's is like a 10.5 with a standard deviation of 20 milliseconds. Me, 8.4 with 120 as a standard deviation. So it's a very broad. Hers is very narrow. So the beauty of this is that she is different from me, and mine is very different from yours. So the beauty of this is that we take that mean and standard deviation, we let the computer to generate a normalized Gaussian distributed noise. Okay, so this is the mathematical function called Gauss-Miller function. So we put the means and standard deviation into that function. The computer will generate a function like that, and then use that to create whole long sequence of a TTL pulse, which is the signal to drive that TMS. Okay, the beauty of this is that if I give you a random pulse, if you have a repetitive thing, it's called harmonic pulse. Okay, the harmonic drive force is the trigger for a seizure. That's how when we do EEG recording, we give you a flashlight. The flashlight is in a given frequency. But if I give you a random pulse, not just I don't induce your seizure, I perturb your seizure pattern. So that we have used that to treat many, what we call this treatment-resistant seizure. The kids with epilepsy with like 160 to 300 episodes per day. Okay, these kids cannot even grow. 7-year-old only 25 pounds because the muscle never get a chance to have a neutral muscle trophy. And when we treat it, in 4 weeks, the body grows 1.5 inches. The mass grows like almost 12 pounds. So that things happens all the time, right? So that this is the one I think we're on the first stage to see how we can perturb that things and then doing that. So tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit differently. Well, of course, I told Judi, I said I intended to make everybody confused because it's a stochastic, right? So the idea is that I want to model this, that disease and health, they are just psychological value of us. Nobody asks if the brain like to be sick or like to be healthy. Okay, for example, we've treated about 15 comatose patients. If the comatose patient can talk to you, he probably say, "Don't wake me up. I'm pretty cool there." Okay, so from a physics point of view, what is the most stable states? That you should see any system is that lowers the potential. Sometimes we call it the local minimum. Anything in the low potential, the system is stable. And in our EEG modeling, we'll see the brain is very low in frequency in comatose or in deep sleep. You don't want to be wake up in the sleep because it's a cool state, right? And now we add our social function, psychological function, to that state of a physical state of it. I go, maybe that's not the reason we want to treat. Just like today, one of the first talk they call the sexologist or whatever, try to say that the sex.
Time. Okay.
Like a sex addiction, they need to be treated as if like a disease. I go, if everybody is treated with a sex behavior, the entire species will be gone, you know? Why do we have to treat that, right? But, you know, there is some criminal behavior involved in there. I go, that's not the reason what a medicine want to do, right? You know, somebody treat, now I travel to Asian countries a lot, and they said, oh, my kids, never get a over F, they never studied. Because that's not my problem, this is a school problem, that's her problem, right?
Exactly.
Why do you treat it, right? So that, let's say you have a straight A students and the ADHD kids, and put them into Amazon jungle. Who is going to survive? I think that the ADHD kids probably will take him as a food, right? To me, we have to clearly understand that what is the entity we're treating, right? So yeah, that's the reason. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Super quick, so we saw some impressive results after the first session, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Typically, is there a typical number of sessions that you see your clients kind of needing?
Yes, we do have no typical session. For example, for autism, I prefer to have at least 2 months of treatment. Okay, that's the one that we like to have. But I also notice the cultural difference in the different countries. When I treat here for 2 months, everybody said, hey, can you go shorten? It's too expensive. I go, that's your kids. You care about money that much? Okay, so normally we go like a 22 to 40 session maximum in this country, and the results is about 55 something. I also had a couple of clinics in Taiwan, and when I look at their average episode, it's about 6 months. Which is way better. It's close to 70% of efficacy. So every time when I went to Taiwan, I told parents, I said, oh, your kids are done and already have 3 months. Don't do it. It's, oh, okay, don't do it. Well, as soon as I left, and there's a Rob, our front desk girl, and then bring them cookies and everything. Can we stay for a little longer? So that's a very different cultural difference. But I see for autism, for example, they need more. For comatose, I need even longer, right? But for Parkinson's patients or like a stroke patients, yeah, we do a much longer time.
How far apart are these spaces? Are you seeing them daily?
It's daily.
5 days a week.
5 days a week.
Okay, but for PTSD, and for example, we're dealing with COVID, 5 sessions to 10 sessions, that's it.
And those are 1 hour sessions, correct?
No, 30 minutes.
Or 30 minute sessions.
Yeah,
30 minutes.
6 seconds of stimulation during each minute. So at 6 seconds, you have that live stimulation, 54 seconds you rest, and 6 more seconds. And so that happens 30 times in 30 minutes. That's a treatment session. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, before you finish it, let me ask one more question.
Yes.
Okay, I am a psychiatrist to start with. How many of you are psychiatrists? You
Oh,
are
we got
psychiatrists?
one. That's good.
Don't feel offended if I say something nasty. Okay. So when I want to be a psychiatrist, back to the old time, right? My father, he was a philosopher, so he joked with me. He said, "You want to be a psychiatrist?" I said, "Yeah." He go, "Okay, you have to admit it. You're dumb, right? You invest that much of time in medical school. I hope you can make a lot of money as a cardiologist or surgeon, but now you choose to be a shrink." And he go, "Okay, that proves how dumb you are." And that. And he said, "Your goal is to use your dumb brain, try to figure out why it's so dumb." He said, "Is it possible?" So this question lasts for 40 years until the last day of his life. He still asks me, "Have you figured that out?" No, I haven't, right? So there's one thing that people make very simple,
Yeah.
but I tend to tell people, okay, God was very busy. You never get a time to create complicated things. Things is very simple. Okay, E = mc squared is super simple. But how to get that simplicity, you need to take some work. Right. So that I think that later on, don't think of serotonin, that kind of things too far. That may far from reality. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.